The widow's black dress rustled against the wooden porch as she aimed the rifle at the drunken cowboy sprawled in her vegetable garden, crushing what remained of her late husband's prized tomato plants beneath his dusty frame. "Get off my property before I decide whether burying you next to my husband would be too generous," Lillian Foster called out, her voice carrying across the dry Nevada air with the precision of a schoolteacher addressing an unruly classroom. The cowboy groaned and rolled onto his back, squinting up at the harsh sun of Pahrump in the summer of 1876. His hat had fallen somewhere in the dirt, revealing a mess of dark hair streaked with dust and what might have been dried blood. Even from the porch, Lillian could smell the whiskey on him, mixed with leather, horse, and the particular scent of a man who had been riding hard for days. "Madam," he managed, his voice rough as gravel, "I apologize for the inconvenience, but I seem to have encountered some difficulty with my horse and the road and possibly a few gentlemen who took exception to my winning streak at cards. So you decided to destroy my garden instead of falling literally anywhere else in this God-forsaken desert." He attempted to sit up, winced, and pressed a hand to his ribs. "Wasn't exactly a choice, madam. More of a gravity situation." Lillian lowered the rifle slightly, her irritation giving way to the practical assessment she had learned during 3 years of marriage to a frontier doctor. The cowboy was hurt, probably more than he was letting on, and despite her words, she was not the sort of woman who could leave even a mangy dog to suffer on her property. "Can you stand?" she asked, her tone marginally softer. "Given enough time and motivation, yes, madam." "The motivation is that I am still holding this rifle. Does that help?" A ghost of a smile crossed his dirt-streaked face. "Considerably." He leveraged himself up with obvious effort, and Lillian found herself setting the rifle against the porch railing and descending the steps, despite her better judgment. Up close, she could see he was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps 25 or 26, with dark eyes that held surprising clarity despite his current condition. His face, beneath the grime, had the hard lines of someone who had seen too much too young. "What is your name?" she demanded, not touching him but standing close enough to catch him if he fell again. "Frank Olson, madam, formerly of Colorado, currently of wherever my horse decides to take me, assuming I can find the damned animal. Language, Mr. Olson. Apologies, madam. Assuming I can find the blessed animal." Despite herself, Lillian felt the corner of her mouth twitch. She suppressed it immediately. "You are bleeding through your shirt." Frank looked down at himself with mild interest as though noticing his wounds for the first time. "So I am." "Would you happen to have any whiskey? For medicinal purposes, naturally." "I have carbolic acid and clean bandages. The whiskey is what got you into this state in the first place." "Actually, that was the 3 men who objected to my card playing, madam. The whiskey just made me optimistic about my chances against them." Lillian shook her head but gestured toward the house. "Come on then. I did not spend 3 years learning medicine from my husband just to watch a fool bleed out in what is left of my tomatoes." Frank followed her with careful steps, each movement measured as though he was taking inventory of which parts of him still worked properly. Inside, Lillian's small house was exactly what he might have expected from a woman who held herself with such rigid propriety. Clean, organized, decorated with simple furniture that showed quality craftsmanship. A portrait of a serious-looking man in spectacles hung above the fireplace, watching them with what Frank imagined was stern disapproval. "Your husband?" he asked, nodding toward the portrait. "Dr. Arthur Foster. He died 2 years ago treating patients during a fever outbreak." "I am sorry for your loss, madam. Sit down before you fall down, Mr. Olson." Lillian pointed to a straight-backed chair she had pulled away from the dining table. She disappeared into another room and returned with a basin of water, clean cloths, and a small wooden box that proved to contain medical supplies. As she worked, Frank found himself studying her despite the various pains demanding his attention. She was perhaps 28 or 29, with dark blonde hair pulled back in a severe knot that somehow made her high cheekbones and elegant neck more pronounced. Her hands were steady and capable as she cleaned the gash along his ribs, though her mouth was pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "This needs stitches," she announced. "Of course it does. I can do it, but it will hurt." "Everything already hurts, madam." "A little more will just add character." Lillian retrieved a needle and thread, which she sterilized with the carbolic acid. "The men who did this to you, will they come looking?" "Doubt it. I rode hard after our disagreement, and they did not seem inclined to follow. They got their money back, which was the main source of contention. So you lost." "Eventually. I was winning before they decided cards were too civilized and knives made better arguments." Her needle pierced his skin, and Frank hissed through his teeth but did not move. Lillian worked with efficient precision, her stitches small and even. She had done this many times before, he realized. Life as a frontier doctor's wife would have required it. "You should remove your shirt entirely," she said. "I need to check for other injuries." Frank obliged, struggling out of the ruined garment with her assistance. The movement revealed a map of scars across his torso and back, some old and faded, others more recent. Lillian's expression did not change, but he saw her eyes track each mark with clinical assessment. "You live a dangerous life, Mr. Olson." "That is one way of putting it, madam. What would be another way? Poorly planned, mostly." She finished the stitches and began checking his ribs, her fingers probing gently but firmly. He winced when she touched his left side. "Cracked, probably, but not broken," she determined. "You will need to rest for several days at minimum." "I appreciate the doctoring, madam, but I should probably move along before those men change their minds about following me." "In your condition, you would fall off your horse within a mile, assuming you could even find it. You will stay here until you can sit upright without looking like you might faint." "I could not impose on your hospitality, madam. You already imposed on my garden, Mr. Olson." "At this point, you might as well be useful. When you can stand without wobbling, you can help me repair the fence you knocked over and replant what can be saved." Frank found himself agreeing, partly because she was right about his condition, and partly because something in her no-nonsense demeanor intrigued him. She was nothing like the saloon girls and dance hall women he usually encountered. She spoke to him like he was a misbehaving student rather than a dangerous man. And instead of irritating him, it was oddly refreshing. Lillian showed him to a small room that had apparently belonged to her husband. The bed was narrow but clean, and Frank sank onto it with relief he tried not to show. "Rest," Lillian ordered. "I will bring you some food in a few hours, and Mr. Olson." "Yes, madam." "If I hear you moving around before I give you permission, I will assume you are stealing from me and respond accordingly." "Understood, madam." She left, closing the door firmly behind her. Frank stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of her moving around the house. He could not remember the last time someone had tended his wounds without expecting payment or other favors in return. The widow Foster was a puzzle he had not expected to encounter in Pahrump, and despite his better judgment, he wanted to understand what made her tick. Outside, Lillian stood on her porch and took several deep breaths. She had not been alone with a man in her house since Arthur died, and the presence of Frank Olson filled the space in a way that made her uncomfortably aware of how quiet her life had become. He was rough, uncouth, and exactly the sort of person Arthur would have warned her about. Yet she had invited him to stay, and some part of her that she did not want to examine too closely was glad for the company, however disreputable. The next morning, Frank woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. His ribs protested as he sat up, but the sharp pain had dulled to a persistent ache. He made his way to the kitchen, where Lillian was setting plates on the table. "I did not give you permission to move around," she said without looking up. "I heard the coffee calling me, madam." It would have been rude not to answer. "Sit down before you tear your stitches." Frank obeyed, settling into the chair with more grace than he had managed the day before. Lillian served him eggs, bacon, and fresh bread with butter, a feast compared to the cold beans and hardtack that usually constituted his meals. "This is delicious, madam," he said after several bites. "Basic cooking is hardly worth commenting on. You would be surprised how many people cannot manage basic cooking. Can you? I can make things edible, mostly. Delicious is beyond my skills." They ate in silence for a moment before Lillian set down her fork and regarded him with those clear blue eyes. "What exactly do you do, Mr. Olson?" "Besides get into knife fights over card games. I work cattle drives mostly. Whatever jobs pay well enough to keep moving. Moving toward anything in particular or just away from things?" The question was more perceptive than Frank liked. "Both, I suppose. That is not really an answer." "No, madam, it is not." Lillian seemed to accept this, returning her attention to her breakfast. When they finished, she collected the plates and brought them to the wash basin. "Let me," Frank said, standing. "You fed me. Least I can do is clean up. You are injured." "My hands work fine." Lillian hesitated, then stepped aside. Frank washed the dishes with careful attention, arranging them on the drying rack the way he had seen her organize everything else in the house. When he turned back, he found her watching him with an expression he could not quite read. "What?" he asked. "You are surprisingly tidy for a man who lives out of a saddle bag. My mother was particular about such things. Some lessons stick. Where is your mother now? Did these past 10 years? Influenza?" "I am sorry," Frank shrugged. "It was a long time ago." Over the following days, an unexpected routine developed. Frank's strength returned gradually, and true to her word, Lillian put him to work repairing the damage he had caused. He fixed the broken fence, replanted what could be saved of the garden, and took on other small tasks around the property that had been neglected since Arthur's death. In return, Lillian continued to treat his injuries and feed him meals that made him realize how much he had been merely surviving rather than living. But more than that, she talked to him, not with the simpering flattery of women seeking his attention or the wary distance of those who feared his reputation, but with straightforward honesty that demanded the same in return. "You are holding that hammer wrong," she informed him one afternoon as he worked on the porch railing. "I am hitting the nail, madam. Seems like I am holding it right enough. You are wasting energy with that grip. Here." She took the hammer from him and demonstrated the proper technique. "See? More efficient. Where did a doctor's widow learn about carpentry? My father was a carpenter in Philadelphia. I grew up in his workshop. How did you end up in Pahrump? I met Arthur when he came to Philadelphia for a medical conference. He was passionate about bringing proper health care to the frontier. It was compelling." Her voice held a note of something wistful. "He was compelling. You loved him." "I respected him greatly. Love was something I thought would grow with time." "Did it?" Lillian was quiet for a moment. "I cared for him deeply. He was a good man, dedicated to helping people. But if I am being honest, which you seem to drag out of me, Mr. Olson, I am not certain I ever truly understood what romantic love was supposed to feel like." The admission hung in the air between them. Frank resumed hammering, processing this unexpected vulnerability from a woman who presented such a controlled exterior. What about you? She asked. Ever been in love? No, madam. Never stayed in one place long enough. That sounds lonely. Sometimes, but it is simpler than the alternative. What alternative? Staying somewhere long enough for people to expect things from you. Lillian considered this. That is a coward's answer, Mr. Olson. Frank stopped hammering and looked at her, surprised. Excuse me, you heard me. You drift because it is easier than forming connections that might require you to be vulnerable. That is quite an assumption, madam. Is it wrong? Frank opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. No, he admitted finally. No, it is not wrong. At least you are honest about it. You make it sound like a character flaw. Is it not? We cannot all be brave enough to settle down and plant gardens, madam. I am not particularly brave, Mr. Olson. I simply decided that running from loneliness was more exhausting than facing it. The conversation stayed with Frank over the following days. He found himself paying attention to the way Lillian moved through her life with deliberate purpose, whether she was tending her garden, treating a neighbor's child who had fallen from a fence, or reading by lamplight in the evening. She had created something stable in this harsh place, something that endured beyond temporary comfort. One evening, about 2 weeks into his stay, Lillian appeared in the doorway of the room where Frank was staying. He had been mending his shirt with surprisingly neat stitches. Your sewing is better than I expected, she observed. Trail life teaches you to be self-sufficient. Come into the main room. I want to discuss something with you. Intrigued, Frank followed her to the small sitting area. She gestured for him to sit in one of the armchairs, then settled into the other with her hands folded in her lap. You are healing well, she began. Well enough to leave if you chose to. Yes, madam. But you have not left. You keep finding things for me to fix. I have found things for you to fix because you have not left, Mr. Olson. Do not confuse the order of causation. Frank smiled despite himself. Fair enough. Why are you still here? The question was direct, demanding an honest answer. Frank took a breath. I suppose I am not ready to leave yet. Why not? Because this is the first place in a long time that has felt like something other than just another stop on the road. Lillian's expression softened slightly. I have a proposal for you, Mr. Olson. I am listening. You clearly need direction, and I could use help maintaining this property. There is more work than I can manage alone, and hiring occasional help has proven unreliable. I propose you stay on in exchange for room and board. I will continue to feed you proper meals, and in return, you will make yourself useful and allow me to teach you how to conduct yourself in civilized society. Frank blinked. Teach me to conduct myself? Yes, you have decent instincts, Mr. Olson, but your manners are atrocious. You slouch. You use improper grammar. You eat like you expect someone to steal your plate at any moment. And your conversation skills, while improving, still lack the refinement that would allow you to make a favorable impression in polite company. I was not aware I needed to make favorable impressions in polite company. Everyone needs those skills, whether they think so or not. The world judges us on how we present ourselves. You are clearly intelligent, despite your best efforts to hide it. With proper guidance, you could be more than a drifter getting into knife fights. Frank leaned back, studying her. Why do you care whether I become more than a drifter? For the first time since he had known her, Lillian seemed uncertain. I suppose because you remind me that there are still people worth caring about in this world, and because I need a project to stop this house from feeling so empty. I would be your project. We would be helping each other. I need assistance, and you need. She paused, choosing her words carefully. You need someone to believe you are capable of grace, Mr. Olson, even if you do not believe it yourself yet. Something in her words struck deeper than Frank expected. He had spent so long thinking of himself as temporary, disposable, someone who passed through lives without leaving marks, that the idea of someone investing in his potential felt almost absurd. Yet Lillian Foster was looking at him with complete seriousness, offering not charity but partnership. "What would these lessons entail?" he asked. "Proper table manners, appropriate conversation for various social situations, how to dance, how to dress presentably, the basics of etiquette that mark a gentleman rather than a roughneck." "You want to turn me into a gentleman?" Frank could not keep the skepticism from his voice. "I want to give you the tools to choose what you present to the world, rather than having only one option. What you do with those tools would be entirely up to you." Frank considered this. "And in return, I maintain your property. And you stop sleeping in your clothes, cursing in my house, and tracking mud across floors I just cleaned. Those seem like reasonable terms. Then we have an agreement." Frank extended his hand. "We have an agreement, madam." Lillian shook his hand firmly. "Then we begin tomorrow. And Mr. Olson, when we are working on your education, you will call me Lillian. Constantly saying madam will become tiresome." "Yes, madam. I mean yes, Lillian." She smiled, and Frank realized it was the first genuine smile he had seen from her. It transformed her face, softening the severe lines into something unexpectedly beautiful. The next morning, Frank discovered that Lillian took her role as instructor very seriously. She began with posture, making him stand with a book balanced on his head while she critiqued his stance. "You carry yourself like you are ready to fight or flee at any moment," she observed. "While that may be practical for survival, it communicates distrust and aggression. Stand straighter but without the tension in your shoulders. Yes, like that. Now walk across the room without dropping the book." Frank made it 3 steps before the book tumbled to the floor. He retrieved it and tried again, and again. By the 10th attempt, he was beginning to understand the balance she wanted, the way to hold himself with confidence rather than defensive readiness. "Better," Lillian approved. "Now we address your speech. You have a tendency to mumble and use incomplete sentences. Speak clearly, project your voice from your diaphragm, and finish your thoughts completely." "I thought I was speaking clearly enough. Clearly enough for a card game in a saloon, perhaps. Not for a dinner conversation or business meeting." Again, with attention to your diction. "Tell me about your childhood in complete, properly structured sentences." Frank grimaced but complied. "I was born in Colorado in 1850. My father worked as a surveyor for the railroad. And he died when I was 12 in an accident involving unstable ground and a long fall. My mother worked as a seamstress afterward, until the influenza took her when I was 15. What did you do then?" "I worked whatever jobs I could find. Stable hand, ranch work, eventually cattle drives. I learned to be useful so people would keep me around." Lillian's expression gentled. "That must have been terribly difficult. It was a long time ago. Grief does not follow a schedule, Mr. Olson. You are allowed to acknowledge that your childhood was hard." Frank found himself looking away, uncomfortable with the sympathy in her eyes. "What about your childhood? You said your father was a carpenter." "He was. My mother died when I was young, so I spent most of my time in his workshop. He taught me to appreciate craftsmanship and precision. When he died, I was 22 and suddenly without prospects. Arthur offered stability and purpose. I convinced myself that was enough." "Do you regret coming here?" "No. I regret not being honest with myself about what I wanted from marriage. Arthur deserved someone who could love him fully, not someone who merely appreciated his character." "You were honest about it now, at least." "Only because he is gone, which makes the honesty rather pointless." They worked through the morning, Lillian drilling him on proper grammar, social protocols, and the myriad small rules that governed polite society. Frank found it simultaneously frustrating and fascinating. He had never considered how many tiny choices went into presenting oneself as civilized. In the afternoon, she moved to table manners, setting out a full place setting with multiple forks, spoons, and glasses. The utensils are arranged in order of use, from the outside in, she explained. This is your salad fork, this is your dinner fork, this is your fish fork if fish is being served. Why would anyone need 3 different forks? Because society has deemed it so. I am not defending the logic, merely teaching you the system. Frank picked up each utensil as she explained its purpose, trying to commit the information to memory. Lillian corrected his grip on the knife, showed him the proper way to bring food to his mouth rather than hunching over the plate, and demonstrated appropriate conversation topics for various courses. You do not discuss business during the first course, she instructed. Light topics only, whether recent travel, mutual acquaintances. Business and serious topics are reserved for later in the meal. This seems unnecessarily complicated. Most social rituals are unnecessarily complicated. That does not make them less important to understand. They practiced throughout the afternoon, Lillian playing the role of dinner companion, while Frank attempted to eat with the refinement she demanded. He fumbled and forgot the rules repeatedly, but she remained patient, correcting him with the same calm persistence she might use with a student learning mathematics. You are doing better than I expected, she admitted as they cleared the table together later. Most men would have given up out of pride by now. I am not most men, apparently. No, you are not. She said it thoughtfully, as though recognizing something she had not noticed before. Over the following weeks, their days fell into a pattern. Mornings were devoted to lessons in etiquette, conversation, and social graces. Afternoons found Frank working on repairs and improvements around the property, while Lillian tended her garden or saw to her occasional patients. Evenings, they spent reading or talking, the conversations growing deeper as they became more comfortable with each other. Frank found himself looking forward to their lessons, not because he cared particularly about which fork to use, but because he enjoyed the way Lillian's face became animated when she explained something she considered important. She had opinions on everything from literature to politics to the proper way to greet someone on the street, and she defended those opinions with articulate passion. You disagree with me, she said one evening when they were discussing a newspaper article about women's suffrage. I do not disagree that women should vote, Frank clarified. I am questioning whether the men currently in power will ever willingly share it, which is why women must demand it rather than asking politely. Demanding things from people who hold all the power rarely ends well. Neither does accepting injustice simply because fighting it is difficult, Frank smiled. You should be giving speeches, Lillian. You have a way of making arguments that are hard to dismiss. If I gave speeches, half the men in this territory would dismiss me simply because I am a woman. They would listen to you before they would listen to me, regardless of which of us made more sense. That is probably true. Does that not bother you? Of course it bothers me. Stupid does not stop being stupid just because it is common. Lillian laughed, a genuine sound of delight that made Frank's chest feel unexpectedly tight. I appreciate your blunt assessment, even if your grammar still needs work. I thought my grammar was improving. It is, but you still say me and Lillian instead of Lillian and I. That seems like a minor thing to worry about. Minor things accumulate into impressions, Frank. That is the entire point of what I am teaching you. She had started calling him Frank rather than Mr. Olson, a shift that had occurred so naturally neither of them had commented on it. But Frank noticed, the same way he noticed that she had stopped wearing only black and had begun adding small touches of color to her wardrobe. A blue ribbon in her hair, a gray shawl instead of black, small rebellions against the widow's weeds she had worn for 2 years. One afternoon, while Frank was repairing the barn door, Lillian appeared with a package wrapped in brown paper. "What is this?" he asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Open it." Inside was a new shirt, well made from quality fabric in a deep blue that matched his eyes. Frank stared at it, something uncomfortable lodging in his throat. "Lillian, I cannot accept this." "Why not?" "It is too much." "It is a shirt, Frank. Your current shirts are held together by hope and stubbornness. If you are going to live here and represent this household when you go into town, you need to look presentable." "Represent this household?" She looked slightly flustered. "Well, people talk. They know you are staying here, helping with the property. Their impression of you reflects on me, so it is in my best interest to ensure you look respectable." Frank studied her, noting the slight color in her cheeks. "Is that the only reason? What other reason would there be? Maybe you care about more than just how things look to the neighbors." Lillian met his eyes and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of the thing that had been growing in the spaces between their conversations and shared meals. "Perhaps I do," she said quietly. "Is that so terrible?" "No," Frank said, his voice equally quiet. "No, it is not terrible at all." They stood there in the barn, dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light, the new shirt still clutched in Frank's hands. He wanted to close the distance between them, to see if her lips were as soft as they looked, but something held him back. She was a respectable widow, and he was a drifter she had taken pity on. Crossing that line could ruin everything they had built. "Thank you," he said instead. "For the shirt, and for everything else." Lillian nodded, seeming to understand all the things he was not saying. "You are welcome. Now try it on. I want to see if I estimated the size correctly." Frank changed in the barn, and when he emerged wearing the new shirt, Lillian's expression made something warm unfurl in his chest. "It fits well," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. "You have a good eye." "I had practiced making shirts for Arthur, although you are built quite differently than he was." Frank was broader through the shoulders and chest, his body shaped by years of physical labor rather than scholarly pursuits. He saw Lillian's eyes trace those differences before she looked away quickly. "We should probably discuss dancing," she said, clearly searching for safer ground. "There is a social next month at the church. It would be good practice for you." "I do not dance." "You do now. Or you will once I teach you." Frank groaned. "Is that really necessary? Would you rather I tell everyone you are afraid of dancing?" "I am not afraid. I just have no interest in making a fool of myself." "Then you will learn to do it properly so you will not make a fool of yourself. Come inside. We will start with a simple waltz." In the main room, Lillian moved the furniture to create space, then wound up the music box that had belonged to her mother. The tinny melody filled the small house as she turned to face Frank. "Put your right hand on my waist like this. Your left hand holds mine." "Yes, that is correct. Now the basic step is quite simple. You will step forward with your left foot while I step back with my right." Frank tried to focus on the steps, rather than the fact that he was touching Lillian Foster in a way he had been carefully avoiding for weeks. She smelled like lavender and bread, and this close, he could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes and the way her pulse beat at the base of her throat. "You are not paying attention," she said. "I am paying attention." "Then why did you just step on my foot?" "Because I am paying attention to the wrong things." Lillian looked up at him, and understanding dawned in her eyes. "Oh, yes." Oh, they had stopped moving, standing frozen in the dance position while the music box played on. Frank knew he should step back, make some joke to diffuse the tension, but he could not seem to make himself let go of her. "Frank," Lillian said softly, "I know. I am sorry. I should not. I am not asking you to apologize. I am asking you what you want." The question hung between them, demanding honesty. Frank took a breath. "I want to kiss you. I have wanted to kiss you for weeks. But you are a respectable woman, and I am someone you took in out of charity. I will not take advantage of your kindness." What if it would not be taking advantage? "What if I wanted you to kiss me?" Frank searched her face. "Do you?" "Yes," Lillian whispered. "Yes, I do." He kissed her then, gently at first, giving her every opportunity to pull away, but she did not pull away. Instead, she rose on her toes and kissed him back with a fervor that matched his own, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders as though afraid he might disappear. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lillian laughed shakily. "Well, that was not part of the lesson plan." "Should I apologize? If you apologize for kissing me, I will be very cross with you." Frank grinned. "Cannot have that. No, indeed." She stepped back, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled slightly. "We should probably discuss what this means." "What do you want it to mean?" Lillian considered the question seriously. "I want it to mean that we are both brave enough to acknowledge what is happening between us. I spent 3 years in a marriage where I pretended to feel things I did not. I will not do that again, Frank. If we pursue this, it has to be real." "It is real for me, Lillian. You are the first person in longer than I can remember who has made me want to stay somewhere. But will you stay? Or will you wake up one morning and decide the road is calling you again?" It was a fair question, and Frank knew his answer mattered. "I cannot promise I will never feel restless. That is part of who I have been for so long. But I can promise that if I ever feel that way, I will talk to you about it rather than just disappearing. You deserve at least that much. I deserve someone who chooses me, Frank. Not someone who stays because it is convenient or because leaving would be complicated. You are right. You do deserve that." Frank took her hands in his. "I am choosing you, Lillian. I am choosing this life we are building together. I am choosing to be someone worthy of your regard. That is why I have been working so hard at all these lessons you are teaching me. I thought you were doing it because I was making you. At first, maybe. But now I am doing it because I want to be the kind of man you deserve, the kind of man you could build a future with." Lillian's eyes filled with tears. "That is the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. Arthur never said romantic things. Arthur said respectful things, grateful things, but never anything that made me feel like my heart might burst from my chest." Frank pulled her close again, resting his chin on top of her head. "Then he was a fool for all his education and good character. He was not a fool. He was a good man who did not love me the way I deserve to be loved. There is a difference. And what about me? Do I love you the way you deserve?" Lillian leaned back to look at him. "Do you love me?" Frank had not said the words out loud before, had barely admitted it to himself, but standing here with Lillian in his arms, he could not imagine any other truth. "Yes, I love you. I love your stubbornness and your opinions and the way you never let me get away with half answers. I love how you see potential in people others have given up on. I love you, Lillian Foster, and that terrifies me more than any knife fight ever has." "Why does it terrify you?" "Because I have never had anything worth losing before." Lillian reached up to cup his face in her hands. "Then we will both be brave together. I love you too, Frank Olson. I love your honesty and your willingness to learn and the way you fix things without being asked. I love how you make me laugh and challenge my assumptions. I love you, and yes, it terrifies me too." They kissed again, and this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty. This was a claiming, a promise, a beginning. Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened. They still maintained propriety in public. Lillian still insisted on separate bedrooms, but the quality of their interactions had changed. There was tenderness now in the way Frank helped her with household tasks. Romance in the way Lillian would reach for his hand as they sat reading in the evening. Frank continued his lessons in etiquette, but now Lillian would reward his progress with kisses, and he found himself motivated by more than just a desire to improve. He wanted to make her proud, to be someone she could present to the world with confidence. The church social arrived on a warm evening in September. Frank dressed carefully in clothes Lillian had helped him select, making sure every detail was correct. When he emerged from his room, Lillian was waiting in a dress of deep green that made her eyes look like summer sky. "You look beautiful," Frank said. "You look quite handsome yourself. All that practice has paid off." At the social, held in the church hall decorated with lanterns and autumn flowers, Frank put his lessons to work. He greeted people with the proper etiquette Lillian had drilled into him, made appropriate small talk, and when the dancing began, he led Lillian onto the floor with confidence born of their many practice sessions. "You have improved remarkably," she murmured as they waltzed. "I had a good teacher." "You had a demanding teacher. Good is debatable. Good and demanding are not mutually exclusive." Around them, Frank could feel the eyes of the town watching. He knew what they saw: the widow Foster dancing with the rough cowboy she had taken in. Let them watch, he thought. Let them see that he was not just some drifter passing through. He was a man in love, dancing with the woman who had taught him that grace was not weakness but strength. When the dance ended, several women approached Lillian to compliment her on how well she had civilized her companion. Frank bristled at the phrasing, but Lillian squeezed his hand in warning. "Frank has always been a gentleman," she said smoothly. "He simply needed practice expressing it in social settings." Later, as they walked home under a sky full of stars, Frank voiced his irritation. "They talked about me like I was a dog you had trained. I know, people can be condescending. It did not bother you, of course it bothered me. But getting angry at their ignorance would not change their minds, showing them consistently that they are wrong will eventually." Frank considered this. "When did you become so wise about people?" "When I realized that most people are simply afraid of anything different. Their rudeness is armor against their own uncertainty. You always find the most generous interpretation." "Not always. Sometimes I just want to hit them with a shovel." Frank laughed, delighted by her unexpected vulgarity. "Lillian Foster, did you just threaten violence?" "I said I wanted to, not that I would. There is a difference. Still, it is nice to know you have limits to your patience." "Everyone has limits, Frank, even me." When they reached her house, their house now in every way that mattered except legal, Frank pulled her close on the porch. "Lillian, I want to ask you something. I am listening. I know we have not been together long, not in the traditional sense. But I also know I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I want to build a life with you, a real life, not just this arrangement where I am your hired hand who happens to share your meals." "What are you saying?" Frank took a breath. "I am saying I want to marry you, Lillian. I want everyone to know you are mine and I am yours. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to be your partner in everything, not just the man who fixes your fence." Lillian was quiet for a long moment, and Frank felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Then she smiled, that beautiful smile that transformed her entire face. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you." Frank whooped and picked her up, spinning her around on the porch while she laughed. When he set her down, they were both grinning like fools. "I do not have a ring," he said. "I should have planned this better. I do not need a ring right now. I just need you. You have me. You have had me since I woke up in your garden and you threatened to shoot me." "I did not actually threaten to shoot you. You heavily implied it." "Well, you were crushing my tomatoes." Best mistake I ever made. They married a month later in the same church where they had danced at the social. Lillian wore a simple dress of cream-colored silk, and Frank wore a new suit that made him look like a different man from the dusty cowboy who had fallen into her garden months before. The ceremony was small, attended by neighbors and the few friends Lillian had made in her years in Pahrump. When Frank slipped the gold band onto her finger and promised to love and cherish her for the rest of his life, he meant every word with an intensity that surprised him. That night, in the bedroom they would now share, Lillian was nervous despite her years of marriage to Arthur. "This feels different," she admitted as Frank carefully unpinned her hair, letting it fall in waves down her back. "Different how? With Arthur it was duty, expected. This feels like something I have chosen, something I want." Frank kissed her gently. "We have all the time in the world. There is no rush. I am not nervous about the act itself. I am nervous about how much I want this, want you. It feels overwhelming. Good overwhelming or bad overwhelming? Good, definitely good." What followed was tender and passionate by turns, a discovery of each other that went beyond physical pleasure to something deeper. Afterward, lying tangled together in the sheets, Lillian traced the scars on Frank's chest. "Tell me about this one," she said, touching a long mark across his ribs. "Bar fight in Denver. Someone took exception to my comments about his card playing. And this one, a puckered scar on his shoulder, stampede. Longhorn caught me when I was not paying attention. You have lived such a dangerous life. I have survived. There is a difference. And now I plan to live a much safer life with my beautiful wife. The most dangerous thing I want to encounter is your temper when I forget to wipe my feet." Lillian laughed and swatted his chest. "I do not have a temper. You absolutely have a temper. You just hide it under a layer of perfect manners. Maybe you bring out a different side of me. I certainly hope so." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and Frank woke several times during the night just to reassure himself that this was real, that he had somehow been lucky enough to find this remarkable woman and convince her to love him back. Life settled into a new rhythm after the wedding. Frank continued to improve the property, expanding the garden and repairing the small barn until it could house the horses he planned to acquire. Lillian continued her informal medical practice, treating neighbors who could not afford to travel to the nearest doctor in Las Vegas. They worked side by side, partners in the truest sense. Frank learned to anticipate Lillian's needs, to read her moods and adjust accordingly. Lillian learned to trust Frank's judgment, to lean on his strength when her own faltered. 6 months into their marriage, Frank returned from a trip to town with unexpected news. "There is a ranch for sale," he announced. "The Double Creek Ranch, about 10 miles north. The owner died and his children want to sell rather than maintain it." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I have been saving money from the odd jobs I do in town. It is not enough to buy the ranch outright, but it might be enough for a down payment. We could run cattle, build something bigger than this small property." Lillian set down the bread dough she had been kneading. "You want to be a rancher. I want to build something lasting with you. The ranch would give us that opportunity, but only if you wanted to. What would we do with this house? Keep it, rent it out for income, or use it when we need to stay in town?" "But Lillian, that ranch could be our future, a place we build together from the ground up." Lillian was quiet, thinking. "Show me the property before we make any decisions." They rode out the next day, and Lillian had to admit the ranch was impressive. The house needed work, but it was solidly built with good bones. The land was well watered with a creek running through it, and there was ample grazing for cattle. "We could make this work," she said thoughtfully. "It would be hard work. The best things usually are. And you would not miss the freedom of the open road." Frank took her hand. "Lillian, you are my freedom. Building a life with you is more liberating than any amount of drifting ever was." They bought the ranch, taking on debt for the first time in either of their lives. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Frank proved to be a shrewd businessman, negotiating good prices for cattle and hiring reliable ranch hands. Lillian managed the books and ensured the household ran smoothly while still maintaining her medical practice. The work was exhausting. There were days when Frank came in so tired he could barely eat before falling into bed, and nights when Lillian stayed up late treating a sick ranch hand or balancing accounts that refused to balance. But through it all, they had each other. A year after buying the ranch, Lillian discovered she was pregnant. She told Frank over dinner, watching his face carefully for his reaction. "A baby," he repeated, as though the word was foreign. "Yes, due in late spring if my calculations are correct." Frank's face split into the widest smile she had ever seen. He came around the table and pulled her into his arms, mindful of his dusty work clothes. "We are going to have a baby," he said wonderingly. "You are going to be a mother. And you are going to be a father. How do you feel about that?" Terrified, thrilled, completely unprepared, all of those things at once. "I know exactly what you mean." The pregnancy was difficult at times. Lillian suffered from nausea in the early months and swelling in the later ones. Frank fussed over her constantly, insisting she rest more and work less, until she finally had to tell him firmly that she was pregnant, not fragile. "I just want to make sure you are safe," he protested. "I am safe. I am healthy. And I am going to continue doing the things I have always done, just with more frequent breaks to rest. At least let me help more with the household tasks. You already help plenty. I can help more." Lillian smiled and kissed him. "Fine. You can take over the cooking for a while. But if you poison us both, do not say I did not warn you." Frank's cooking turned out to be better than expected, though not quite up to Lillian's standards. He learned to make simple meals that were filling if not particularly elegant, and he took pride in being able to care for his wife during her pregnancy. Their son was born on a clear morning in May 1878, after a labor that lasted through the night. Frank paced outside the bedroom while the midwife attended Lillian, feeling more helpless than he had in any dangerous situation he had ever faced. When the baby's cry finally rang out, he burst into the room to find Lillian exhausted but glowing, holding a small bundle wrapped in soft blankets. "Meet your son," she said softly. Frank approached as though walking on sacred ground. The baby was tiny, red-faced and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair. When Frank touched one impossibly small hand, the baby's fingers curled around his thumb with surprising strength. "He is perfect," Frank whispered. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names during the pregnancy but had not settled on anything definite. Now, looking at his son, Frank had a sudden certainty. "Henry," he said, "after my father, if that is acceptable to you." "Henry Foster Olson," Lillian tested the name. "Yes, I think that suits him." Fatherhood transformed Frank in ways he had not anticipated. He had thought himself incapable of the patience and tenderness required, but when Henry needed him in the middle of the night, Frank found reserves of both he had not known he possessed. He learned to change diapers, to soothe crying fits, to marvel at every tiny change in his son's development. Lillian watched her husband become a father with deep satisfaction. The rough cowboy who had fallen into her garden was gone, replaced by a man who ran a successful ranch, spoke with confidence in business meetings, and could waltz at community dances while making polite conversation. But more importantly, he had become a man who loved openly, who was not afraid to show affection, who had learned that true strength included vulnerability. One evening when Henry was 6 months old, Frank found Lillian on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the Nevada sky in shades of orange and pink. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, settling beside her. "How far we have both come." 2 years ago, I was a lonely widow maintaining a small house in town. You were a drifter with no plans beyond the next job. Now look at us. Ranchers and parents. Who would have thought? I knew you had it in you. From the moment you tried to apologize for ruining my tomatoes while clearly in pain. I seem to recall you being more interested in shooting me than recognizing my potential. I was evaluating whether you were worth the effort. Clearly, I chose wisely. Frank laughed and pulled her close. So did I. You saved me, Lillian, from a life of just existing without really living. We saved each other. I was going through the motions too, pretending my life had meaning because I was maintaining Arthur's legacy. You reminded me that I could want things for myself. What do you want now? Lillian leaned her head on his shoulder. Exactly this. You, Henry, the ranch, the life we are building together. Maybe more children someday if we are blessed. More children sounds perfect. They were blessed with 2 more children over the following years. A daughter they named Grace in 1880, and another son they named Thomas in 1882. The ranch prospered as Frank's reputation as a fair dealer spread through the territory. Lillian's medical practice expanded to the point where she trained several local women as nurses to help with the demand. Frank never completely lost his rough edges, but he learned to balance them with the grace Lillian had taught him. He could negotiate with cattle buyers in the morning using perfect etiquette, then work alongside his ranch hands in the afternoon without pretension. He had become a bridge between 2 worlds, equally comfortable in both. Lillian remained his anchor, the person who kept him grounded when stress or old restlessness threatened. On rare occasions when Frank felt the pull of the open road, he would talk to Lillian about it as he had promised. They would ride out together, just the 2 of them, and spend a night under the stars like he used to do. But now he always wanted to come home, to return to the life they had built. Years passed. The children grew. Henry proved to have his father's head for business and his mother's compassion, taking naturally to the ranch work. Grace inherited Lillian's sharp intelligence and Frank's stubborn determination, announcing at age 10 that she intended to be a doctor. Thomas was quieter than his siblings, content to spend hours helping his mother in her medical practice or reading in his father's study. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Frank took Lillian to San Francisco for a week, leaving the children with Lillian's trusted nurse and the ranch foreman. It was their first time away together since Henry's birth, and they reveled in the freedom to simply be a couple again. "We should do this more often," Lillian said as they walked along the waterfront, her hand tucked into Frank's arm. "Visit San Francisco. Take time for just us." I love our children desperately, but I had forgotten what it was like to have an entire conversation without being interrupted. Agreed. Though I do miss them already. So do I. But I am enjoying having you to myself for a while. That night in their hotel room overlooking the bay, Frank pulled out a small box. "What is this?" Lillian asked. "Your anniversary present. Open it." Inside was a delicate gold ring set with sapphires. Lillian gasped. "Frank, this is too much." "Nothing is too much for you. Besides, I never properly gave you an engagement ring. This makes up for that." Lillian slipped the ring on, admiring how the stones caught the light. "It is beautiful, but you know I do not need expensive things to know you love me." "I know, but I wanted to give you something beautiful anyway." "You have given me everything, Lillian. A home, a family, a purpose. Let me give you something that shows the world how much you mean to me." Lillian kissed him deeply. "You show me every day in 1,000 small ways, but I love the ring anyway." They made love that night with the passion of newlyweds and the tenderness of old partners, a combination that years of marriage had only deepened. Afterward, wrapped in each other's arms, Lillian thought about the journey that had brought them here. A rough cowboy had fallen into her garden and changed both their lives. She had taught him etiquette and grace, but he had taught her just as much about courage and openness. Together, they had built something neither could have created alone. When they returned home, the children rushed out to greet them, all talking at once about everything that had happened while they were gone. Frank scooped up Grace while Henry and Thomas competed for their mother's attention. Standing on the porch of the ranch house they had restored together, surrounded by the family they had created, Frank caught Lillian's eye and smiled. She smiled back, and in that moment, they both understood that they had found what they had been searching for without even knowing they were searching. Not just love, though there was plenty of that, but true partnership. They had each made the other better, stronger, more complete. As the sun set over the Nevada desert, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Frank pulled Lillian close and whispered in her ear, "Thank you for teaching me grace." "Thank you for showing me it was worth the effort," she whispered back. The children pulled them inside, chattering about dinner, and a new foal in the barn and 100 other small details that made up the fabric of their daily lives. It was not the life either of them had imagined for themselves, but it was exactly the life they both needed. Years continued to pass, marked by the steady rhythm of ranch life. The children grew into capable adults. Henry took over more of the daily ranch operations as Frank's hair turned gray at the temples. Grace left for medical school in the East, writing long letters about her studies and the injustices she witnessed in hospitals that refused to take female doctors seriously. Thomas surprised everyone by discovering a talent for teaching, opening a small school on the ranch property for children of the workers. Frank and Lillian grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. On quiet evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sunset, hands intertwined, comfortable in the silence that came from knowing each other so completely that words were often unnecessary. One such evening, when Frank was 60 and Lillian 58, she turned to him with a contemplative expression. "You ever regret it?" she asked. "Regret what?" "Settling down, giving up the freedom of the road." Frank considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked something important. "No, not even for a moment. That was not freedom, Lillian. It was running away from the possibility of having something worth losing. You taught me that real freedom is choosing what you want and building it with your own hands. I taught you table manners and how to dance. You taught yourself the important things. You gave me the tools and the reason to use them. That is teaching enough." Lillian leaned her head on his shoulder. "We did well, did we not? We did better than well. We built something that will last beyond us. The children are good people, making their own marks on the world. The ranch is prosperous and provides for dozens of families. We have loved each other truly and deeply for decades. I would say that is more than well. You have become quite eloquent in your old age, Mr. Olson. I had a good teacher for that, too." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and stars began to appear. Inside the house, they could hear their grandchildren laughing, the sound carrying through the open windows. Henry had taken over the ranch completely now, and his 3 children were growing up in the same house their father had. "You think they will stay?" Lillian asked. "The grandchildren." "Some will, some will not. Grace certainly will not. She has too much of the world to change. But I think at least one will want to keep the ranch going. It gets in your blood, this land. Like love. Exactly like love. You do not choose it so much as it chooses you, and once it has you, nothing else will do." More years passed, measured now in grandchildren's birthdays and harvest seasons, and the slow, steady changes that came with age. Frank's hands grew gnarled from decades of ranch work, but they were still gentle when he helped Lillian with tasks that had become difficult for her. Her eyesight weakened, so he read to her in the evenings from the books she loved. They celebrated their 40th anniversary, surrounded by 3 generations of family. The ranch house overflowed with children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, all gathered to honor the couple whose love had created this sprawling family tree. Henry gave a toast that brought tears to Lillian's eyes. "My parents taught me that grace is not about following rules, but about treating people with dignity and respect. That love is not just a feeling, but a choice you make every day. That building something lasting requires patience, hard work, and partnership. Everything I am, everything this family is, comes from their example." Later that night, exhausted but happy, Frank and Lillian lay in bed together. 40 years, Lillian marveled. "It seems impossible." "Best 40 years of my life. Even the hard parts, especially the hard parts, those are what proved we could weather anything together." Lillian turned to face him, tracing the lines of his beloved face. "I never imagined I could be this happy. When Arthur died, I thought my life was essentially over. I would maintain his legacy and eventually fade away. Then you fell into my garden. Best accident I ever had, falling or falling for me. Both, definitely both." They kissed, a gentle press of lips that held 40 years of love and partnership and unwavering commitment. When they finally drifted off to sleep, it was with the contentment of 2 people who had found exactly what they needed in each other. Frank lived to see his 75th birthday, celebrated with the same abundance of family that had marked his anniversary. He died peacefully in his sleep 6 months later, with Lillian holding his hand. His last words to her were simple: "Thank you for teaching me how to live." Lillian grieved him deeply but without regret. They had built a remarkable life together, and she had loved him with her whole heart. She had no unspoken words, no unresolved feelings. Their love story was complete. She lived another 5 years, spending her time with her children and grandchildren, passing on the lessons Frank had helped her learn about courage and grace and choosing love every day. When she died at 73, surrounded by family, her last thought was of the rough cowboy who had crashed into her garden all those years ago and changed everything. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, under 2 oak trees Frank had planted shortly after they married. The headstones were simple, bearing their names and the dates of their lives, but also an inscription that Henry had chosen. Together they built grace from roughness and love from chance. The ranch continued to thrive under Henry's management and later his children's. Grace became a renowned surgeon, fighting for women's rights in medicine until her death at 82. Thomas's school expanded into a full academy, educating hundreds of children over the decades. But it was the love story of Frank and Lillian that became the foundation of the family's identity. Parents told their children about the widow who taught a rough cowboy proper etiquette, and the cowboy who learned grace for her alone. About how they had built something lasting from an improbable beginning, proving that love was not about perfect circumstances, but about 2 people choosing each other every day. Their story became legend in Pahrump, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. The house in town where they had first lived became a historical site. The ranch remained in the family for over a century, a testament to what they had built together. And on quiet evenings, when the sun set over the Nevada desert in brilliant colors, people said you could sometimes see 2 figures sitting on the porch of the ranch house, hands intertwined, watching the day fade into night. Whether this was truth or wishful thinking, no one could say for certain. But the story endured, as the best love stories always do, a reminder that grace and roughness, when combined with love, could create something beautiful that lasted far beyond a single lifetime. The widow had taught proper etiquette, and the rough cowboy had learned grace for her alone. But in the end, they had taught each other something far more important. That love, when chosen deliberately and nurtured carefully, could transform two incomplete people into something whole and lasting and infinitely precious. Their love had not just changed them. It had created a legacy that would ripple through generations, proof that even the most unlikely beginnings could lead to the most extraordinary endings.